Welcome to NightLight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is NightLight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to NightLight. I'm really glad you could share another Monday night with me. We're going into Section 7 of Genesis 6 Conspiracy by Gary Wayne with him. And it's a fascinating journey as we go through these different sections. We're able to get into intricacies and subtleties that if you are trying to review the whole book at one time, you just don't have the opportunity to get into. And this way I get to ask questions that have been hovering for a while, and I get to ask Gary those questions that pertain to the different sections that we're going through. Tonight is the House of Dragon, Bloodlines of the Prehistoric Giants, and it reveals far-reaching Genesis 6 conspiracy allegories that impart and help you to comprehend little understood royal dragon bloodlines of giants, numerous religions, and secret societies throughout history. It's a fascinating trail to follow, and I have going through it, I keep thinking I have to ask Gary that, and I have to ask Gary that, and we could absolutely do. This could be the Gary Wayne hour, as far as I'm concerned. Well, it feels like it kind of now, but there's so much material here. There are so many questions that in getting the answers to them, it casts the spotlight on certain aspects of this whole history that we never thought about before. So let me bring Gary Wayne on. Gary, glad to have you here again.
Glad to be back, and so much looking forward to covering off this section tonight. And I think people are going to find it rather interesting on some of the things. And as you said, there's like literally 1,000 different directions we can go just in this section. And and lots of doors open up with anything that you sort of knock on the door on, and you just find out there's just more stuff always connected to it. But what it starts to do is to really start to merge all of the first parts of the book. So the last two sections will weave in the totality of that knowledge and paint a larger picture of prehistory and what's coming into the end time.
I think one of the things that hit me almost immediately is that you're following the matriarchal fairy owl bloodlines and then the patriarchal dragon raven bloodlines. Wasn't it possible to have a matriarchal and a patriarchal bloodline? I mean, that would be two angels mating, I assume, or two watchers. But why is it, the matriarchal would be, of course, the mother, and the patriarchal would be the father. So we have female angels and male angels that are creating the bloodlines. Why is it the matriarchal and patriarchal? Why isn't it the same for each of the bloodlines?
Yeah, so sort of go to the understanding of polytheism and dualism and the mother goddess, the mother goddess, and the father, patriarchal god. So in polytheist understanding, both the male gods created giants and bloodlines, but so did the female goddesses do so as well. And one of the classic examples that we get coming out of prehistory is with the creation of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh, sixth generation after the flood versus the Gilgamesh that was before the flood, that's recorded in the Enochian Book of Giants. This Gilgamesh is sixth generation king of Uruk. So an inheritor of the dynastic lines of Nimrod, and his father is Lugalbanda, who's a male, obviously, as the king, as opposed to the queen. And Lugalbanda is going to procreate with a bull mother goddess, Nin. And Nin is a fertility goddess, and she's very much in that section of Mesopotamia, the queen of heaven. So she is sort of the representative of the throne of the Sumerian pantheon, as it's governed by the invisible ones or the fallen angels or the gods. So they create a male off of that. That's a direct matriarchal celestial mafia godmother bloodline, versus the typical understanding, let's say like Zeus, and sticking with the polytheist side, Zeus is going to, through Alcmene, produce Hercules. And the Herculidean kings and the Gyges and Gaies kings that are going to flow down and be very much interconnected with the Scythian peoples. So as this section ends up with Lilith, Lilith is either a demigod offspring of Tiamat, which is a female Leviathan type understanding, or a serpentine god, and part of the dozen or so gods of Sumeria before the flood. And so that's the matriarchal line that is the most important from a Sumerian perspective. And you also have the patriarchal line that comes down through Anu before the flood, and then Enki and Enlil after the flood, creating a patriarchal line there. Now, these are different fallen angels as you look into the imagery of it, but it's still talking about the same type of spirits, offspring, and the bloodline that goes with it. So when we look at other dynasties, they all have parent gods, and there's a couple different creations, one of giants before, one after, and then you get into the argument, well, which bloodline crosses, is it merged, and things like that, but that gets into the scioning and your view of how giants show up after the flood. But to understand that there is a two type of watchers that are creating the bloodlines, and one seems to go back to as a matriarchal side for the most part, and the other one seems to go back to the seraphim. So the seraphim is the patriarchal, and the cherubim seems to be more the matriarchal aspect of it. Now, in the spirit sense, because they take a physical form, but in the spirit sense, there is no sex. They're just spirit beings. Mm-hmm. But when we look at how they follow their genealogies and put taciturn imagery around it and write about it, it's the fairy and the owl, which are the patriarchal or matriarchal allegories, and it is the serpent and or dragon and raven. So what you have then is a split where, from a seraphim perspective, you're going to have a fairy and as the matriarch, and you're going to have a dragon as the patriarchal allegory. So for example, if you look at King Arthur, he's son of Uther Pendragon in that Bloodlines, and we're going to be getting back to that probably early, as we get into the show here. And Guinevere is the fairy queen, so that's showing the one allegory set together. But just as Lilith is classified as an owl, you're going to have that matriarchal bloodline come down in, probably I would associate these more with the dark-haired giants that I get into and talk about into Book 2, and who the cherubim are in more detail in Book 2 as well. And, of course, that would be a raven as a patriarchal understanding in that case for the male god of the cherubim. So in the cherubim, they have a face of a humans and typically depicted as dark-haired, and you have and dark beards, just as you have the Anunnaki on reliefs depicted that way. They also have a face or a head of an eagle or a bird, just as you get the same imagery around these reliefs in Sumeria, doing this ritual around this technology that a lot of people like to call the tree of life, and they're holding these crystals or pine cones, and they have these purses or pouches of stuff that's all part of the whole ritual that they're doing. You have the exact same description, the same wings, the same body, but just with an eagle face. So the Anunnaki watchers that are shown there, both there are Anunnaki as they take one head in a physical form versus all four faces that they would have. The other two faces are a lion, which has implications with lion men of Moab and things like that we won't get into tonight. And the other one is the bull. And, of course, we'll be talking about the bull as a significant allegory in the religion of polytheism.
Well, the other thing that has me sort of, it's a question. You have the seraphim watchers and the cherubim watchers. They're each of them a different ranking of angel. Were they the same rank before they fell, or was one above the other and they fell? Because you have watchers in two of these different groups, and yet they are different rankings of angels from around the throne of God.
Typically, the church doctrine puts seraphim as the number one order at the highest level, and then cherubim, and then they don't really talk about the Ophanim, but that's the throne angels that they do reference but don't connect back to the watchers. And those are the angels that look like a cherubim in Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10, where you have the angels that are in the wheels. They have one face of a cherubim, so they're cherubim-like, but they're slightly different, because one of those faces is of a cherubim. It doesn't say which of the four, or is it all four? It doesn't really tell us. But the wheels that are sort of intertwined there are, derives from the Hebrew word Gilgal, but the angels within the wheel, which also a word means wheel, and or throne, is Ophan, and that's where Ophanim comes from for that fourth group of watchers in the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch also classifies the archangels as watchers, but the typical hierarchy within standard Christian dogma puts them sort of down in the third class along with regular angels, which doesn't seem to fit because they play such an important role. So if I were to create a hierarchy there, I would go archangel, seraphim, cherubim, and then the throne angels or the Ophanim. And I would put the seraphim as in charge of the government and the religious aspect of the earth. The cherubim are more the warrior aspect, and then the throne angels represent the different thrones that are in heaven and the ones that are on earth by the fallen angels and by the thrones of the visible ones who are their offspring.
Okay, that clarifies it to a certain extent, because it's always I've heard the angels that fell were the watchers. I didn't realize that there were two different categories of them or two different rankings of them. In
Yeah, in Southeast Asia, they call them Tengu for watchers. And these are where the dragon creator gods come from. They're also the ones that create as offspring things like the dogmen and things like lion giants and creatures like that. So they denote different sort of watchers that are in there. It's just that typically you don't get a dog representative in the watcher angels that are around the throne. But we don't know exactly where a sort of Anubis as a jackal god fits in there, or Nebaz, which is the barking god of the Avim, as well as Nergal, which is the lion god in the Mesopotamian regions that they worship. So, yeah, I would really sort of look at it as, if when we're talking about watchers, that's a generic term, and that's the Hebrew word ayir, meaning to watch. It's the equivalent with Igiji, or Giji, which is for eye, and to watch in Sumerian, and goes to the Igiji, which means watchers, which is why Sumerian Anunnaki are called watchers. But there are different groups, and they're in a different hierarchy, but they're at the peak of sort of a column of lower-ranking angels below them.
Well, let's face it, they did a lot more than watch, clearly.
Clearly.
Okay, so I think this clarifies it for me, and certainly because in Judaism, someone isn't a Jew unless their mother was a Jew, so that the matriarchal thing goes through. So
I don't know whether your mic is kicked out again. I'll just start to talk here. So when we look at these allegories of the bloodlines, these are the bloodlines of the end time Antichrist that are going to be coming about. So in this section, we're taking it back to the prehistorical aspect, back to patriarchal and matriarchal giants, and back to patriarchal and matriarchal fallen angels. And when we look at the hair colors of these different types of branch lines, you have the dark-haired ones that we talk about that I spent a lot more time on in book 2, but you have the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and red-haired, hazel-eyed, pale-skinned giants that are the most dominant ones from the seraphim bloodline. So when we're looking at, as I mentioned, King Arthur with the fairy and the owl, or the fairy and the dragon allegory, that's what that's representing, and basically as being a fertility goddess and the sun goddess. And again, typically they're going to be red-haired and blonde-haired, and again, hazel eyes and blue eyes. And we have a larger concentration of sort of like that strawberry red type that goes over into United Kingdom, and then you have more of the blonde-haired ones that goes up the Danube River. They go into Kiev. They also go into Germany, into Russia, but all the way up to Sweden and Norway and those areas. And it's out of that Tuatha De Danann, who are known as the fair folk or the fairy folk because of their very pale white skin, and that the fairy queens like Guinevere are the fairest of them all, were absolutely embedded in this allegory and embedded into, as we've talked about in shows past, the Holy Grail is an allegory for these bloodlines. And it's intersecting and scioning of bloodlines that will graft into the Merovingians, that will extend into the descendants of the last Merovingian Dagobert, who is a descendant of de Bouillon, de Payon, and Anjou, and who become the first kings of Jerusalem in 1118 on the official rite of inheritance ceremonies that take place to do that. So it's important to understand that these bloodlines are still with us today, and they have this ancient context. And just to underline that, with the English monarchy, you have King Charles III, who's on record of saying that he has his genealogy, and this will go through before they change their name to the Hanovers of Germany. And I know there's some scioning of, Kosaksbergs and a couple other smaller bloodlines out of Germany in there as well, but they would have intermarried with Middle Europa dragon bloodlines. And so King Charles III takes his genealogies back to Vlad the Impaler, which Dracula is based on, meaning son of a dragon. And Blood Drinkers just says Nephilimar, pale skin. And Vlad the Impaler was pale skin, very light red hair, hazel eyes, educated at the Mystery School in Solomon, and took his genealogies back to the Egrathi tribe that was spawned by, in part, Hercules. But through the matriarchal bloodline, I think is how he's making his genealogy back there. And there's another fallen angel involved called Tamiel, that they are Kezidiah, as he's talked about in the book of Enoch. That is the other scioning in of the bloodline. And so the new dynasties are spawned through the matriarchal side. And so I think that's intermarry into the Scythian tribe of the Egrathi, bringing in a Scythian matriarch. And that's how that genealogy goes back. But the point of the matter is that these bloodlines are traced by the royals, who believe they have the divine right to rule, all the way back to specific patriarchs and matriarchs of the giants and specific watcher angels.
How do those bloodlines, though, that now, of course, are really watered down by time, how do they go from being, angels to giants to humans? I mean, how does that? Because usually with these matings, originally they were getting giants out of it, but now we've got people that say, their bloodline goes back to, all the way back to Adam and Eve as far as that goes. So how do you go from the angelic to the giant to human? Because when these watchers were mating with humans, they were getting giants. They weren't getting normal people. So how does that fade on down to the people now who say they go all the way back to Enoch or Lamech or whatever?
Yeah. So typically, there's two main ways that we see giants after the flood. One is a survival, and one is a recreation of the giants. And you could have a rivalry there, and it's the post-Diluvian giants that may have won that side over, or they just continue to intermarry with giants. I tend to fall on a second incursion and a recreation, because we get that in Greek history, we get that in Sumerian history, we get that in the Ugarit, which creates the Raphaim from the offspring god Baal and Anat. And these are the Raphaim giants after the flood. And the Raphaim giants are, again, the red-haired and blonde-haired varieties, and very much akin to how the Atlanteans and most of the giants before the flood that were described. So I just wanted to get that on the table, because that's part of how we sort of get there. So there's a dominant issue here, but either whether or not, let's say Nephilim did survive as well, they'd be larger than the Rephaim, as we've talked about in past shows. But Genesis 6:3 limited life from that point on to 120 years. And even though they would have knowledge and technology to try and extend that, eventually you're going to get down to 120 years, which we see happen after the flood. So it's more easily merged within the giant aboriginals, which are in the lands all around the world before the people of Babel will migrate away after the confusion of languages and go intermarry amongst the aboriginal giants. So with the Rephaim giants now, and one presumes that if Nephilim survived, that it would extend to the same issue, the life and the fertility issue that's going to plague the terrible ones of the post-Diluvian world, which we understand as the post-Diluvian giants. And we know this from the terrible ones, and the meaning of the word terrible ones, and Ezekiel 32 is the best place to read about the terrible ones, and Isaiah 25, where they're going to be dealt with it on a mountain in the end time. But the terrible ones is the Hebrew word erit, and the ones in plural, as it's used in Ezekiel 32, translated into English, would be eritim. So you have all these different definitions to erit and eritim as being terrible ones that are all associated with giants, and then you have this fertility issue that they have. That seems to have been fulfilled not through lack of ovaries or fertile sperm, but from the inability to produce large numbers of females. And so I'd mentioned just a few minutes ago that new dynasties were begat utilizing pure-blood female giants with which would be a fairy or an owl queen to intermarry a ennobled dragon patriarchal bloodline. So biblically, we'll get this as a terrific example to create the Amalekite hybrid race between Amalek and Timnah. And Timnah is a whoring giant. So that example there, because of the fertility issue, they're going to have to intermarry with humans or they're going to go extinct. But here we have a female giant marrying a human. So now you have no issue in terms of how that happens. But we also have accounts throughout polytheist history, and as recorded on reliefs, we see these rituals where females are being sort of held kind of upside down in that V glyph that is the ancient glyph of the womb and the glyph of the Grail, and the split between Jesus and John, or Jesus and Mary Magdalene, as the Da Vinci painting Last Supper shows, and it'll just be this sort of great V that goes up in between them. This is the start of a new dynasty and kingship between Timnah and Eliphaz, and that is going to create a dynasty. But if they did this same thing with the pouring of the sperm into the woman, that would be, I would think, of how you would have a giant could have sex with a human, because they would be so much bigger. It would be, very difficult for that to take place. But the mothers would die anyways, because the babies would probably be in the beginning too much to handle, just as with the Nephilim before the flood, that they would do this sort of ritual cesarean ceremony to sacrifice the woman in favor of the demigod. So they have to continue, because of that fertility issue throughout the generations, to intermarry with new bloodlines or outside the fourth generation as they come to create a self-imposed rule because of all the diseases you get, like with blood diseases, like hemophiliac disease, or as we see it come down with deformities in our age, in the Habsburgs, of the Habsburg dynasty, who intermarried with the Anjou bloodline to inherit out of Lorraine, to inherit the King of Jerusalem title before it goes on to the King of Spain. They were intermarried into this bloodline, and Habsburgs have a specific disease named after them because of that close intermarriage. That's called Habsburg's jaw disease, and if you Google that, it's a deformity of the face. So short story is they did find a way to do it, but they did it because of need, not because of want.
Wow. I mean, there were, I understand. I guess that's where some of the fables or the rumors or conspiracy, whatever, that go that the aliens are coming to this planet because they aren't able to produce they've crossbred so much that they aren't able to have children anymore. So they're coming here to get the women for their fertility so that they can continue their race in other planets and stuff like that. I don't buy that, by the way, but that is a theory that's out there. But it goes back to this
that's
too.
That's part of it. Yeah, I think it's got a connection there.
Well, it's another.
As elementals.
It's another thing where you're seeing a lot of the. I think one of the things that fascinated me with going through the Genesis 6 series, both of them, is that you see things being replicated over and over and over as the different ages progress through time, that there are repeats of things that occur every age we come to that have to be dealt with in one way or another. So that it is fascinating as to how society builds and then destroys itself, and we start over again, and we have so many of the same issues. That old adage of those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it is going on, and we're seeing that repeat again here today. So having an understanding of what went on gives you a better understanding of how to prepare for what may be going on, and maybe in a way giving us a way to either put off or change what comes in the future. One never knows.
Yes, that's the only way we can understand what is likely to come, is to understand how it's come to its fullest fruition for records that we have, which is just before the flood. And the flood is brought so that the world isn't going to be destroyed by fire. That's my speculation because of the technology that they had, and that we do know in 2 Peter 3 that destruction by fire is saved for the end time, reserved for the end time, just as it was in the beginning, which I won't go down that rabbit trail right now, but it's important to understand that was an intercession with a different kind of apocalypse so that all things could play out as they're supposed to play out, and all the names in the book of life will have their opportunity to be on the earth. So if we want to have a better understanding to anticipate what we need to watch out for, we need to understand what happened just before the flood with the violence and the level of technology that was earth destroying by fire, which we obviously have to this day, and that it was the Nephilim before the flood that brought all the violence. And it was Azazel in the book of Enoch, one of the watchers, who taught all the arts of war, all the crafts of war, all the strategy, all the weapon making, so that they could destroy humankind from the face of the earth, which was the goal, and which will be the same goal in the end time, which is why Jesus has to step in if indeed we're in the end time on this go around, because again, we may not be in the fig tree generation. I think we are, but we may not be. And if that's the case, then this is one of those cycles again, because nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. And the knowledge and understanding of this only brings grief and sorrow, as Ecclesiastic 1 talks about. And if we understand who the giants are, they are the ones trying to create world empires. The New World Order or world government is the same language as their world empire that they want to create. And it's the new Atlantis in their analogy, which Atlantis and their 10 kings were trying to create before the flood. And that they are the perpetual war people, and they use humans as cannon fodder. All of that has been done throughout their history by these bloodlines. And I wish I would have put one of these passages into book 1, but I was more or less trying to get people to understand what the Royals and the polytheists believe, and whether or not Christians believe it or not isn't really important, except that we need to understand what they believe, because it's what they do with that belief system all throughout our history, all throughout prehistory. What they're doing today and what they intend to do in the not-so-distant future is why we have to understand it. So one of the passages I would have liked to have put, in hindsight, into book 1, but I put it into book 2 because it's more talking through the Bible's language and then interconnecting some of the other things from around the world, versus book 1 is how the Bible intersects with the worldwide testimony. Psalms 21:8, I wish I would have put in there, and I'll just quickly sort of read it. That when I talk about this section of the House of Dragon, which is very popular in media and in entertainment today, and I call it the bloodline of the historic giants, we need to understand the allegories that they immersed their history in, because they controlled all the way through all of our history, all of our teachings, all of the arts. So any literature or entertainment is going to be sown from their writers, and just as the Holy Grail was for and sponsored by the Priory of Sion and the Templars to do all of those writings. Psalms 21:8, thine hand shall find out all thine enemies. Thy right hand shall find out those that hate thee. Verse 9, thou shalt make them as a fiery oven. This is now talking about an end time prophecy. In the time of, I'll start that again, thou shalt make them as a fiery oven in the time of thine anger. The Lord shall swallow them up in his wrath, and the fire shall devour them. End time, fire destruction. End time, you're the Lord's wrath in his anger. Anger is always translated from a word that could be translated as wrath. So it's a sort of a translator's decision there. Psalms 21:10, their fruit shalt thou destroy from the earth, and their seed from among the children of men, verse 10. And it says, for they intended evil against thee, and they imagined mischievous device which they were not able to perform. That passage there, and there's other passages in the Bible that I talk about in book 2, is talking about this bloodline, the serpent seed from the seraphim angels, who created the giants who are going to be the kings, and there's also warrior giants that may have come from the seraphim, but they could come from the other watchers. But it's the bloodlines of the ones provided through the seraphim angels who are in charge of religion and government, who provided their spirits offspring the divine right to rule.
Well, what I don't understand is if, they gave us all this wonderful wisdom, and were they counting on us screwing up? I mean, what I don't understand is why didn't they just wipe out humanity instead of humans the tools to wipe themselves out?
So the fallen angels, they won't admit this, but they wouldn't deny it either, I don't think. The fallen angels, they were created immortal, and they were also created with seemingly almost unlimited access and knowledge of God. Not that they know everything that God knows. If that was the case, they would have not have ensured Jesus, as 1 Corinthians talks about, was crucified. Because if they'd known about the resurrection, they wouldn't have done that, because that sealed their fate. So what's going on here is that they had all of this knowledge, and yet they still rebelled. And so God knew, and Jesus knew, they're Alpha Omega, as they're described in the New Testament. They know the beginning from the end. They know everything that is going to be decided, because they have that size of knowledge, which is just infinitely greater than what fallen angels would have, even though they have significant knowledge. And so God lets everything play out through free will. I prefer the word free choice. The dogma is free will, but God allows all sentient beings to make a choice, to follow God, to follow his laws, or not. And he's allowing every individual to sift themselves and to sift each other, as it turns out. And so the fallen angels, they made their choice. The Adamites were created as the resolution to the angelic rebellion. And we were created with little knowledge, and we have to create our immortality through our faith, through the resurrection. That's why Jesus was sacrificed, so he could adopt us as sons of God, as inheritors of eternity into the future time. And that And it does that even though we have human fathers, so we're going to be like angels. So what happens is when Adam is created, the fallen angels know that the intent is to convict them in their rebellion. And so they start a series of revenges against humankind, but they don't like to get blood on their hands. And so it's one of the reasons why, one of quite a few reasons I part with some Christians and Gnostics as a whole, not Christians as a whole, but Gnostics or polytheists as a whole, that say Satan is the father of Cain and get there through their interpretive approach. Satan and the fallen angels, they know how powerful God is. They know they don't want to cross a certain line, otherwise some really bad things will happen. So what they did was, in the Eden account, Satan is working, and he's likely in his cherubim format, just as he's understood as the anointed cherubim in Ezekiel 28, and not under the name of Satan or the devil, or Halel, as he's known as the morning star name. He's probably in there as Gadrael, as the book of Enoch talks about, which means wall of God or God's wall. As you dig into it, you find out those two words are Hebrew, and that's where that name would come from. Not named Samael, that the Kabbalists say is the seraphic name for Satan. So Satan is in the Garden of Eden, but not as a serpent, and therefore he's either coaching or acting as the avatar for the Avatara Nahash being that's already, and their whole species has already been converted into polytheism. And as you take that back to Nahash's source word for serpent, it means like a sorcerer and a necromancer and an enchanter, all words that are associated with priests and priestesses of the polytheist religion that worship the pantheon of the gods. And then what they do after that fall, the fallen angels, is they create the giants to do the dirty work. The giants were created to destroy humankind. And so that the fallen angels could say, yes, we created them, but they're the ones who did it. Whatever sins they did, that's on them. But they're the ones that are coaching as the invisible ones, the visible ones who rule this earth. So that's all been permitted to play out. In humankind with the Adamites, and, Adam, if he would have chosen differently, things would have been different. If Cain would have chosen differently, things could have been different. If in the time of Israel, if the Israelites had chosen better, we would have finished off from that point forward with the blessings of the covenant, not the curses of the covenant that we're currently going through, because God lets things play out through free choice. But he knew this all along, but he's allowing everybody to leave their name in the book of life or have it blotted out by what they choose and what they do. And this period continues until those names all have that chance to make that choice.
Okay. I think that what, too, when you kind of scooted on by this, that Satan was really the father of Cain. Was he the father of Cain by Lilith or by Eve? Was Eve the mother of Cain?
So in the Bible, it says Eve and Adam are the parents of Cain.
Yeah.
Yes, and Seth. And through an interpretive allegorical approach, some Christians will say, no, it doesn't really say that, because Cain and acquired are kind of similar words, and Cain is rooted in kana in Hebrew to get or to receive, words like that. So when we look at what happens in the Garden of Eden, Satan isn't the one that's punished. It is the Nahash and all other species who are punished. They lose their speech, they lose their intelligence, they lose their limbs, and they turn into the serpentine look of a snake that we understand it to be today. And so when we look at the offspring of the serpent seed, well, it's not then a hash that had sex with Eve, and we don't get that in the language. If you take it back to the original Hebrew, there's just absolutely no way you can get there. It's not that I'm against Satan being the father of Cain or Lilith being involved, but it's not Christian. So how this comes about is, first of all, through Kabbalism, which is Judaic mysticism that comes back from Babylon and brings the Sumerian accounts with them. And in that is the Lilith tradition. And so it's Lilith that is going to be a consort in that tradition as it comes back, a consort of Adam. And that's how Cain comes along. But that's not what the Bible says. So it depends on what belief system that you're in. Other accounts of Gnosticism says it could be multiple angels that raped Eve to produce Cain. So that even in polytheism, and there isn't that sort of perfect sort of consistency. And so we don't get the account of Lilith and Eden until after the return from Babylon. And that's where Kabbalism, which is the Eastern version of the Essenes, of the Egyptian therapeutic, is going to find some kinship within monotheist Judaism, with a period starting with the Second Temple. So I have a 4 series of document in a series of 4 that I go through all the language of this, and biblically I just can't get there. Not that I'm against it. So the serpent seed that is prophesied as a result of this is the giants coming from the seraphim angels and the sons of God who create the giants in Genesis 6. And this becomes the serpent root, as Isaiah 14 is talking about. And again, I cover all that off in book 2 as we get into some really sort of deep imagery, allegories, and some things called dual prophecies.
Yeah, it to me, I mean, the bloodlines fascinate me because, they start out with the angels and then they transfer into the humans and the bloodlines that we have going on today. And it just it blows me away as to how things sort of, fade one into the other. And I was not aware that the Tuatha De Danann went back that far. I mean, I understood it was before the Druids and stuff, but I did not realize that it was almost back to the beginning. The Tuatha De Danann were around.
Yeah, and both before and after the flood. And in the Labor Gabala, the history of the Irish, they have that recorded. And the descriptions of the Tuatha De Danann, both before and after the flood, are identical with the Atlanteans. Blonde-haired, red-haired, blue eyes, and hazel eyes. And they're identical to the Scythians, which is one of the 4 to 5 groups of Indo-Aryans after the flood. And they are the aboriginals that we talked about after the flood. So again, they either survive or they're recreated. And in Greek tradition, the Scythians are the ones who escape out of the prison in Hades called Tartarus, which is also in 1 Peter, is the word that hell goes back to, that Jesus is talking to while he's still in the grave with the spirits that are in prison in Hades. But in the Greek tradition, Scythians and the giants in the rebellion that were locked in there before the flood, something which probably earthquakes or portals opening or chaos and confusion, however it is, many of these giants escape out of Tartarus and are how part of the giants show up after the flood. But also remember that, and as I cover off in book 2, is that the Greek accounts also have 2 groups of giants. one that was wiped out in the wars before the flood, and the second group that's created after the flood by Zeus and the offspring gods.
But don't the angels, take part in battles at all ever? Or is it just that, it's their creations that do battle on earth, and the angels just sit back and, have bonbons by the fire, so to speak, while their giants, slaughter each other here on the earth plane?
Yeah, as you look at how each civilization has the same religion and the same pantheon, it's through the hierarchy of the nations and the number of angels throughout that hierarchy through the world, where you're going to see this start to play out through the nations that they rule, that are going to war with each other. So yes, they will be praying to their gods for strength. They may even be being advised by those gods, but there's probably a stronger case that they're not talking actually to the gods after Babel. Because both the parent gods who did the worst crimes against humanity and creation went to the pit prison at the time of the flood. And then again, if you have a second incursion, which seems to make sense, because like Baal and Anat, who create the Rephaim in the Ugaritic text after the flood, they disappear sometime around or after Babel because they did the same crimes. So you have periods before the flood where they probably had that direct interaction with them, after the flood for a short period of time, but are they still interacting to that degree with each of the nations, or is it the demons who answer to the council of the gods in the hierarchy doing that and saying that they are angelic? Remember, the demon spirits are the disembodied spirits of the giants.
Well, what happened now when Cain was kicked out, when after he killed Abel, when he was kicked out, he went to the land of Nod, and that was totally populated. And were those the blackheads that are described here? And then as we come forward in time, are we dealing with the prodigy of Adam and Eve, or are the blackheads not around anymore? What happened to them?
Yeah, good question. So when Cain gets ostracized, as you say, he goes to Nod, to the land of Nod, east of Eden, and so on the other side of the Euphrates River, and he finds a wife that shouldn't be there. And biblically, people will say, well, it's one of the daughters that were born to Adam and Eve, of course. Well, of course, if the Bible's sequencing there would make that sort of impossible. But if you look at the details of when daughters are born to Adam and Eve in Genesis 5, it says that Seth is born when Adam is 130 years old. And so sometime before, Cain and Abel are born, and sometime between when they're 20 and 30 years old, 20 and 40 years old at adulthood, they're going to do their offerings of the first fruits that the Israelites did as part of their rituals and part of the laws of the worship of God. Uh-huh. And it's Cain who doesn't give the first fruits, and he's the one who gets all upset because Abel receives the favored praise and whatever blessings would come along with it, and he kills his brother. So those are the only two people. And in Genesis 5, sometime after the birth of Seth, which isn't even born at this time and not even mentioned until the end of Genesis 4, after, it's detailing Cain's genealogy, you have Seth that is born similar in the same way that Cain is born. Again, using the language that is suggesting in the same way as Cain was born through Adam and Eve, as again it says. So when we look at that detail, sometime after that, after 130 years, so let's give 40 years in Eden, and we don't know how long, but by inference, it's not that long after Eve this happened. So, and I think I'm being generous with the 40 years. So, and then sometime between 20 and 40 years after that, you have the first fruits being offered by the offspring, and then the murder. So all you've got now is 60 to 80 years, sort of max, and then there's another 50 years after this ostracization when Seth is born. So he cannot find a wife there. It's not, or the Bible just doesn't make any sense in its details, and that's not my position. So day 6 people are a different group of people in a different creation. And, you've got complete different details that are in conflict. It's not additional details, it's in conflict. And again, the only way they could be the same creation would put you in saying that the Bible conflicts with itself. But if it's a separate creation of 4 races in moles all over the earth and told to eat from any tree that they wanted out of the earth and to be like hunters and gatherers, and the agrarian nature doesn't come to these 4 races that would include the blackheads, the Sumerians, which I think that's where Noah lived and that's where Adam lived, because Eden was between the Euphrates and the Nile River and Mount Hermon and the Indian Ocean. So it makes perfect sense that the geography testifies to that as well. So these 4 races are created with male and female and plural. In the Eden account, you get Adam in singular. Sometime later, Eve is created. And then there's a different order to the creation. And maybe in book 4, I'll get into this. But I think there's a restart here because even the order is different. And you have the recreation of Adam that's in a completely different way with a special commission and having breath breathed into him by Jehovah of the Elohim, the Word of God, to create that race of people for the commission to bring about the Messiah and the resurrection plan and the salvation of humankind and the ending of the angelic rebellion. So the only way that things make sense in Genesis there, without contradictions, is that you have this race of people that was created sometime within 1,000 years as the maximum, again, pulling in 2 Peter 3, which is a day is 1,000 years, and that was the passage I mentioned earlier that the fire is reserved for the end time, just as it was in the beginning, which again is another time frame that I don't want to get off track on, but just to explain the connection there. You have a lot of time, and sometime after day 7, we don't know how long, because there's no day 8 recorded there, is the Adamites are created. So we have these gaps. And if you have a different creation with an unknown size of gap, you could have thousands of years between the creation of day 6 and the Adamites, and a lot of time for the Nahash species to be corrupted by the pantheon of the gods and the 4 races. So that's how those people come about. So yes, I think Cain brings the agrarian knowledge from the 7 sciences and starts to domesticate humans in a significant way and becomes their king, and is now going to create a people and daughters who are going to be willing participants to marry the fallen angels in Genesis 6 to create the giants, because they've been well prepared to do that. And Cain introduces that pantheon to these people. And so with that in mind, the last part of the question that you were saying is do blackheads show up after or by inference all 4 races after the flood? Well, empirical evidence says we have different races, 4 generally speaking, but it's only Noah and the 8 from the Bible tradition that show up after the flood. So you get down to 2 sort of ways that could happen. One is, just as polytheism accounts all around the world, there's a human survival story on arks, going to the top of a mountain, being saved by fallen angels, just as you have giant survivals in the same sort of way. So it's possible that the fallen angels would have saved some humans as well, and by inference, some of each of the four races. From a biblical perspective, you can only get to the four races that show up after the flood if all four wives who are unnamed are not only pure of spirit and flesh, but also representative of each race, and then through the female genes, just as the giants believe through the female genes, the angelic gene is passed on. This would be the races of the matriarch that's in the matriarch are passed on, and that's how we have the four races show up after the flood. Either way, biblically, the wives being of each of the races makes the most sense.
To go back for just a second to Cain, and when Cain and Abel brought their gifts to God, that Abel's was accepted because he was the result of Adam and Eve, but that Cain had more of a divinity in him and more was expected of him, and therefore God rejected his gift, and that's why he was rejected.
That's what some people say, but the text doesn't tell us that. What the text tells us is that Abel took the first fruits of what he did to God, but Cain didn't take quote-unquote first fruits, just took some of what he took for the offering, and it's the first fruit aspect that is the only biblical detail that we can sort of rely on. Now, I'm not discounting that Cain may have not already started to sin and started the rebellion and all this other stuff before that, but we're not told that. So that's speculation, and it's not bad speculation. I'm not saying that it's not possible. It just doesn't say that. And so what I try and do is I just try and base on what's there. But I'm fine with people speculating as an add-on on that. But let's also look at what the text says, which is the significant piece.
Well, that and the fact that he found a wife where there weren't supposed to be people, which in many ways, it's almost saying as though there were two waves of creation when it comes to human form. So that you have your the sixth day, and then you have Adam and Eve starting. Yeah, almost as though it's the newest model. Kind of like if they were cars. And
that's how polytheism phrases it. There's different tries at humanity, and then on the second go around, and in some accounts there's several attempts, but the general direction is the blackheads were the final ideal product, so to speak. And the other thing that doesn't make any sense is that Cain was afraid to go and that he would be killed. And so God gave him a mark to let everybody know he has protection. And if there was nobody there, who was he afraid of?
Well, and who's going to see a sign and say, "Uh-oh, I can't kill this guy"? It's a little silly. It works in the Bible, though.
Well, it's going to have to be something. It's going to have to be he's going to have to be like a shining being, or he's going to have something that somehow is able to communicate people, don't mess with this guy. And whatever that was, we're not told what that mark is. Now, the polytheists, like the Rosicrucians, have an understanding what they think the mark is, but I think they're speculating too, and it's just basically like an Oribus with an Ankh on the inside.
Well, a good tattoo artist could replicate that. So, there's got to be something that identified him, whether it was almost like a shield of some sort.
So
prevented.
What's in? Yeah. Another thought is there's a book, and it's apocrypha, and it's kind of, it's hard to know the legitimacy of it. It's called the Book of Lamech, of Cain. And in there it says, and it's kind of an extension out of the book that came out, the Lost Book of King Og, which is connected to the Manichaean Book of Giants, which is a polytheist version of a mixing of the Persian version of the same story with the Book of Giants. But in that book, and again, I'm just throwing it out just to say, hey, because nobody knows what it is. That's another possibility, is that he had his skin color changed to this ghostly white color, just like when giants were created, they had that very pale, ghost white, shamanic, white face type of skin. And so that's what that book says, that was the mark. But again, we don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. So,
of course not. I do want to make sure we cover two other areas. The bull cult of Melchizedek and the Moses Akhenaten comparison. I want to make sure we only have another hour, and I want to make sure we hit both of those.
And where did you want to start on that?
Well, let's start with the Melchizedek, which I've always been fascinated with, because nobody knows where he came from, theoretically.
Yes, and theoretically. So with Melchizedek, and you can pronounce this any way that you want, it's a compound word. Could be Melchizedek, as it would be pronounced with the two individual Hebrew words, means king of righteousness. You have a connection between old and historical, but let's say the time of the Templars, that makes this very, very important to understand. And you have a polytheist version of who Melchizedek is, and also the monotheist version of Melchizedek. So it's important to understand that there's two different orders. And in the first part of Book 1, I mentioned that Melchizedek is thought to be Shem by the Gnostics and the secret societies, and they make a reasonable case for it. But again, we don't get that physical transformation of Shem biblically, but because we're not told who he is, it's a plausible thing. But biblically, he doesn't have a genealogy. So if you match up the accounts of Melchizedek in Genesis 14, which is interestingly enough in the War of Giants, just after the War of Giants, where this person who doesn't have a genealogy back to the table of nations, but is king of Jerusalem, in a city that would have been controlled by Jebusites and Amorites at that time, comes out to bless Abraham, and Abraham gives him a tenth of everything, and he's a priest of God. He's a priest king of God, of Jerusalem, which makes no sense if he's a hybrid Jebusite and Amorite, right? So you have this interesting thing that when you ask some really difficult questions on, is that there has to be a little bit more going on here with who he is. And so in the book of Hebrews, as it covers him off, it says that he doesn't have a mother or father and no genealogy. So that means that this is going to be someone very, very important, and he's not going to be Amorite and he's not going to be Jebusite. This is to make and I cover this off in Book 2 for people. He is basically an oiketerian, which is a soul and a body created by one of the angelic realm or of the realm of heaven. In this case, Jehovah of the Elohim, the cognate word of God in the New Testament, the word logos of the God Theos, just as you have the Spirit of God in Genesis 1, which is Ruach of the Elohim, that's hovering over the earth in Genesis 1:2. You have Elohim, in this case, because Ruach is already there. This is going to be Elohim singular for El Elyon, the Father. And the word is there, Jehovah, as when God speaks, Amar, as you have the renewal of the earth in Genesis 1. And Amar is the word of God. And so we get introduced officially to Jehovah of the Elohim, who is the word of God, in Genesis 2:4, and then the creation of the Adamites, so that you get a full sense. But all three are there. So this is Jehovah of the Elohim, creating an oiketerion for himself. And again, biblically, we know he does this because he creates himself as the angel of the Lord, Malek of Jehovah, and the angel of God, Malek of the Elohim. Again, if you understand the Hebrew and the consistency of the terms, it makes perfect sense. So this is the pre-existent Jesus. And just as Jehovah of the Elohim creates an oiketerion for him in the Sodom of Gomorrah narrative in Genesis 18, where he and two angels who take bodies visit Abraham, and he doesn't even know it's the Lord at the beginning. He has the ability to do this. So just to give premise for what I'm talking about. So this is the pre-existent Jesus that is blessing the fellow Abraham, who is going to create the nation of Israel that is going to be fathered through Isaac, whose name is changed to Israel. One of his sons named Judah is going to create the bloodline for the Messianic tradition that goes through David and goes through Jesus. And this is the same Melchizedek order that Jesus is going to inherit, or Jehovah is going to inherit, as talked about in the book of the Psalms, just as the Word of God takes over this priesthood for the future time as an immortal, so it never has to be replaced. And it's actually a resolution in the future, as the book of Hebrews is talking about, to replace the high priest that had fallen. One of the other aspects of Satan is his priest aspect of it, with his 9 jewels in his vest that represented, just as the Levites were created as a temporary priesthood with 12 jewels on their vest. When he fell, he was also high priest. So he was Archon, or Archangel. He was Seraphim. He was Morning Star. He was Cherubim. And we don't know the other things and titles that he would have had, but he was the greatest of all the angels before pride set in, according to Ezekiel 28. So Melchizedek order is prized by both sides, just as the bloodline of Jesus is prized by both sides, and why it's so very, very important. And that the Templars held the secrets of the message, and part of the founders of the Templars were the Essenes. And we covered all of that off in previous details of those connections to the Essenes and the discovery of knowledge and documents and everything at the temple destruction, that the Essenes were the last of the priesthood that were there during the destruction, so they could give the Templars the directions as to where to go to excavate to get all of this stuff. So now that we have an understanding of that, the polytheist version of the order of Melchizedek that Jesus is going to inherit is the Canaanite order of Melchizedek. So now you have Gnostic Gospels out there that are Melchizedek books as well, or Gospels. There's 2 of them. You should feel free to read them, but be on the lookout that they're dealing with a lot of polytheism in there. But understand that not only the Gnostics, but the secret societies also recognize the Canaanite order. And they recognize that this is going to be part of the pedigree that Antichrist is going to claim. And this is part of the Canaanite order, which was the bull cult of El, the parent god, who created giants before the flood with Ashtaroth, and then the offspring of Baal and Anat, who create the Rephaim giants after the flood, and that the Baalim are the ones who are the council of the gods that are ruling from Mount Hermon, that are talked about in the Old Testament, and that Baal and Moloch and others are classified as bulls, just as the Ugaritic text calls the gods of Mount Hermon, which includes El, Baal, Amor, and all of the Baalim. They were called bulls, and their offsprings were called bulls as well. We would know them also as the bulls of Bashan, which is in the Mount Hermon region. So understand, this is the Canaanite version of that drafting in of the Melchizedek order, that is for the dragon Messiah bloodline and for the pantheon of the gods, that he will become the high priest as the Antichrist in the end time, and he sets up his own religion based on that and destroys Babylon. And the other imagery that comes in with this bull cult is going back to the cherubim imagery. So again, you're going to have watcher bloodlines, probably of both, that are also scioned into there. So when we look at all of the different allegories and the history and the different intersections, I mean, it goes right from the beginning of the flood on Melchizedek right through to the end time and into eternity, but it goes even deeper to the bull cult and the sun cult of the original Enochian mysticism created by Enoch, son of Cain, before the flood, where he takes the knowledge that Cain learned from Adam while in Eden, splits it into the seven sciences, then creates the mystical sun-worshipping and bull cult after the pantheon of the gods that he is intermarrying with, and then he's going to accept the knowledge of the fallen angels or gods in the polytheist versions, and they are going to create these bloodlines through the merging of that religion and the merging into this creation of gods in the physical world with the Nephilim, with immortal spirits and initially immortal bodies, which is why life is limited in Genesis 6:3 in the creation of the giants, Genesis 6:1-4, in the preamble to the flood story, all throughout Genesis 6 and Genesis 7. So the bull cult is the Enochian mysticism, the sun cult. Just as all the gods in the pantheons, the head god is called a sun god, and they are an allegory for Satan. And we get that from the Gnostic side of the secret societies, where they use as their post-Diluvian allegory Isis and Osiris. Osiris in the secret societies, and this is also the bull cult of Egypt. So again, the imagery fits perfectly. Osiris is said to be an allegory for Lucifer, or as we would understand them from a Christian perspective, Satan, who sits above the council of gods. Osiris is a queen of heaven and a allegory for the original queen of heaven, likely the female Leviathan that was killed by God in the days of creation.
So you have, you brought the sun worship in, which does take me right to Moses and Akhenaten and the Armana dynasty, because of course Akhenaten, changed the religion in Egypt to not a person but the sun. So it was monotheism when he took over, and of course. The comparison between Akhenaten and Moses I found fascinating.
It is a very convincing story that they make that Akhenaten was actually Moses. Where it falls apart are on some of the important details. Is number one, the biblical chronology doesn't line up. And even using the secular chronology, it's a bit out of whack as well. So Akhenaten comes along in about the 1200s. The Exodus, from a biblical perspective, is about 1450. So it doesn't sort of match up. And even if you try and consolidate some things down and try and get those timelines a little bit closer, then you start to throw a bunch of other things out of whack. So there's always going to be a bit of a difference, and usually it's about 600 years between biblical chronology and secular chronology, because they're trying to marry up dynasties from other cultures. And what happens, though, is just as angels can have up to 7 names and titles, so are kings. And so it gets very difficult. So, Akhenaten changes his name to Akhenaten. And when he's born, he's Amenhotep, the 4th, son of Amenhotep the 3rd. And Amun is the parent god of the pantheon that Aten is part of. And so what Akhenaten does is he says, no, I'm going to take that cheap pantheon god, which is kind of a ram god, and he's going to demote him. Doesn't eliminate him, but just take one other god of the pantheon up and say we're going to worship Aten as the sun god. And one of the interesting things between Hebrew and the Egyptian languages is in one language it's a D, in the other one it's a T. So in Hebrew, Aten would be spelled instead of, A-T-E-N, it would be A-D-E-N, which is very much identical to the Hebrew word Adon, A-D-O-N. But, and then in the original vowelless Hebrew, it would be just A-D-N, and it would be A-T-N in Egypt. So it essentially you get down to the same word. And Adonai, that word means Lord and my Lord. And so in the King James Version Bible, where you have Jehovah of the Elohim, you have Lord God put in there. And there's a lot of reasons why they do that. I won't go into it tonight. I don't necessarily agree with the reasons to do it, but it allows for confusion and conflation. So I would prefer a different translation there, just as they used to do it, and put the real name in as they did before the Babylon diaspora in the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, where the southern kingdom was exiled to Babylon. So when we look now at that, you have this, they seem to be maybe the same God, except that God is never referred to as a sun god. He's too far above a sun god. And Adon is the same, is part of the pantheon of gods in Egypt, as he's known as Aten, but he's also known as Adonis and Adon in the Phoenician and in Middle Eastern culture. So again, they're just sort of conflating the God of the Bible as El in the superlative uppercase sense with the parent god also named El of the Canaanite pantheon. So again, you can see how easy it is to do this, and that what the polytheists will deliver to us is all sorts of things in the end time, because they want to convert Moses to Akhenaten. And I think I put enough information, and they have more, believe me, in book 1 here to show you that they can make a convincing case, except when you get into some of the things that just don't fit. But they're going to deceive a lot of people because they want you to believe, they particularly want Christians to believe, that originally the religion of Moses, Akhenaten, as they'll say, was the religion of Egypt, which is the second branch of Enochian mysticism, the sun-worshipping bull cult after the flood, with Babel being the first pillar, Egypt being the second pillar, and from those 2 points, this pantheon was spread all around the world after Babel. And Akhenaten is a dragon bloodline. So what it now does is it puts a dragon bloodline into the main patriarch for all 3 monotheist religions: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, all linked back to Moses. And with Islam, that's their greatest patriarch, right? It's important in Christianity too, and it's probably the most important patriarch in Judaism. So what they say is that Moses brought the religion of Egypt to Israel, and in the time of the monarchy to create a mythos for the new kingships and the bloodline of David that they like to scion into their Nephilim bloodlines for the dragon Messiah, they perverted the original polytheist religion into a monotheist religion. So one of the ways they can sort of collapse the three monotheistic ones to fold them into the coming Enochian mysticism of Babel, the Babylon religion in the end time, is that tactic. And I want people to know that if what I wrote seems convincing that they might make a pretty good case for it, I did that so that people would know that I don't have all the information and they're going to have more. But we have to understand that the basic principles of that doesn't make any sense. They'll also say that Moses was not adopted into the family or found, and that is just false history written by the rewriters of the Old Testament.
Well, I think what's fascinating and confusing in that at some point in time, these other branches kind of took a step aside and went in a different direction. What was the purpose of it? I mean, if you look at conspiracy theories, I mean, they run rampant here because you have the Gnostics and you have the Essenes and you have, the different major religions that do have these differences. Was the purpose to weaken the truth, or so that people were confused and got disoriented? I mean, what was the purpose to water it down or change it? I mean, to take it in a whole nother direction that now people believe is the truth, and yet it does not go back to the original. Why were these branches created? And they're created beautifully, and a lot of them make great sense. So what was the purpose? Is this free will?
Are you talking?
Free will and confusion?
Yeah,
is that the point?
Well, it is because Judaism, as we understand it today, but at that time it would be the whole northern and southern kingdom, was an absolute island in a sea of Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would always have incentives from the outside working with people from the inside of the Israelite culture and religion. And also understand they didn't drive all the peoples out, which was lots of doorways to come in and lead people away from the God of the Bible, as the Bible records. And so there would be lots of money, there would be lots of power promised, there would be lots of people willing to say, how do we get rid of this monotheist religion to be like the rest of the world? And a lot of times Israel, they became stiff-necked and they became polytheists, and they would get conquered and they would then repent, and then God would send a rescuer and a deliverer, and then they'd win, and then they were good for a while, and this went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, which is why they eventually suffered the full curses of the covenant. Now understand, God remembers his covenant, and he will, through the curses, reconcile the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom in the last 3.5 years. But that's just to throw a little bit more context in. And all of this is all of these forces around the whole world always encircling to try and wipe the knowledge of God from the face of the earth and the people who follow them. That's been the blood oath all the way through, which is why I underline that blood oath all the way through in this book, because it's always the same. And that comes from the oath of Haram Anathema on Mount Hermon, meaning to carry it out to the end, no matter what the consequences is, even with an ecclesiastical denunciation of the worst kind that would go with it. And this is the oath sworn by the 200 watchers to implement the legal oath-based system on the world through the spurious offspring that they were going to create to destroy humankind from the face of the earth. So when we talked about that intermarriage between Eliphaz and Timnah to usurp that inheritance of Israel, the blessing, the inheritance, and the Messianic promise, they're the ones who are waiting for Israel when they come out of the Exodus, when they've not been trained for war, when they're hungry, tired, and they're there to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Why? Because they would inherit the dragon Messiah promise, they would inherit Israel's inheritance, and they would inherit the blessings. And how would they go about that? Because Eliphaz is son of Esau, brother of Jacob, who had all of that taken away from him through trickery by Jacob, who has his name changed to Israel. From that point forward, the giants swore that same oath to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. We see that oath all throughout history to wipe them from the face of the earth. And we see nations with their terrorist groups acting as their governments today, swearing that same oath and putting it into the Constitution. It is a transgenerational blood covenant to do the very reason for and to carry out the very reason that those bloodlines were created. Now, I'm not saying all Palestinians are bloodlines of the giants. I'm not saying all people of Phoenicia and Lebanon today, but certainly you have the same oath, and the rulers of those groups probably have Philistine or Tyrian bloodlines of giants.
Well, you also have that hidden group, the world group leaders, the 300 and so on and so on and so on, that all believe they came from royal bloodlines, and that their destiny is to rule the world too. So you got fanatics all over the place here. I mean,
yeah, and they're all working directionally for the same, but with the latter that you just talked about, there can only be one ruling dynasty of the world. So that only gets settled through perpetual war, which is why they put us through all of this, because they're going to continue to do so right through to Armageddon.
Well, will Armageddon actually be a battle, or will it be more of a mass destruction? My feeling is that our times of war, battles with armies and stuff like that, really should be coming to an end. There should be other ways of settling things, short of nuclear war. Because
there would be if you didn't have those with the perpetual war gene in complete power.
Yeah, and they got there through probably thousands of years of breeding. It also makes you feel like as though that humanity is really a huge breeding pen, looking to get the best of the species. So theoretically, and yet people are waiting for a Messiah to come that would be outside of our bloodlines.
Yes, every group of people around the world is, looking for a Messiah. It's in all the cultures around the world. It's one of those in religions in the whole world, and they all have an end of an age. And whether or not it's the Western version where we're in that age of the age of Aquarius, it's just called by a different name. It's the same thing all over the world. We have a different outcome in the monotheist version out of the Bible, but it's talking about that same period of events and the same destruction by fire. And there will be a Messiah that comes from the Arab community as well. And you don't get that out of the Quran, but the hadiths that they use to interpret their version of their hadiths that they would use to interpret the Quran, and there's a different hadith for Sunnis and and she is. And if there's any other sex, there's probably a different hadith for that as well. But don't mean to be, making fun of it, but it's just that it changes the meaning of the Quran, unfortunately. But they call it the Mahdi. And in their tradition, there'll even be a war between the two Mahdis. And there'll be one that takes over. And in that tradition, it's thought from a polytheist insertion on this of that same sort of outcome is that, and this is more from Nostradamus on the era of the great Arab War of the end time, is that the winner will be the one that most of the world is cheering for, but will turn out to be the worst one of the two, whatever that means. But there'll be the messiahs of the Western bloodlines that we've talked about in other shows, the great monarch, as the Anjou would like to present. And they got at least 3 or 4 rivals trying to get their messiahs out there and in position as well. And then you have Lord Maitreya coming out of the Aryan side of it and in the subcontinent of India. I expect there'll be Antichrist show up from the Chinese bloodlines, from the Japanese bloodlines, from the Ingaroka bloodline, from the bloodlines of the Aztecs and the Kish Maya. I think we'll see all sorts of Antichrist-type figures because we're told biblically to be aware that there will be multiple Antichrists before the true Antichrist defeats one Antichrist wannabe that becomes so great that the world thinks he's an Antichrist, and he takes credit for killing the Antichrist and then introduces the last 3.5 years with the crowning of his inheritance in the temple in Jerusalem as the king of the world and probably the priest of the Melchizedek order of the Canaanite tradition.
But doesn't that in some ways suggest that humanity is very much like the Russian people used to be, in that they were so used to having a czar that ruled them that when they had freedom, they looked to choose a country that would be their ruler because they were so used to having a ruler they didn't want to have to rule themselves, and it means that humanity as a whole can't take with their free choice or will or whatever you want to call it. Why do we have to have a king?
We don't. And God's intention was for us not to have a king. In the Adamite line before the flood, and as it splits into the Sethian line versus the Cainite line that will be part of the introduction of kingship, the giants, the Sethians did not have kings. After the flood, the descendants of Abraham didn't have a king. And when Israel became a nation, they had Moses as a leader, but he wasn't the king. And then they had Joshua, but he wasn't the king. And then they, were very much decentralized, and they had judges that would be appointed in times of need. And only after over 400 years after the period of the judges, and perpetual kind of war, as they backslide and they get beaten quite badly and become vassal nations, they have judges raised up all throughout that age. But after that period of time, they say, we want to have a king, and because we want to be like the other nations. And they ask for King Saul because he's a full head, neck, and likely part of the shoulder taller than any other Israelite, and he's a giant like the other kings of the other nations. It's absolutely incredible, the information that they want to have a king, that they're tired of the judges. And so God doesn't want to do that because it puts too much power into the kingship hands. And as we know, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's just a matter of time. And you need that sort of decentralization not to have the tyranny take hold. And it's a good lesson. And it's been with us all the way through time. So But God knew that this would happen, and he permitted the king. And then he knew King Saul wouldn't follow in the ways that he wanted, and then he chose somebody after his own heart to be king. But by the time you get into King Solomon in his later age, he's starting to fall away, right? He's marrying other queens and bloodlines from other provinces. And that is leading him into polytheism. One deduces, and we don't get it, but one deduces that he probably repented in late old age again. But he had all the knowledge of that God, was providing everything that he wanted, and yet he still, in his age, he set up bull cult worship of Chemosh and Molech. It's all the same god of the Baalim gods to worship, all through the wives. And so, but this is the system that has come down, and this was not God's intention. This is a combination of humans trying to survive using warriors, but the only warriors that they seem to choose to protect them for the most part are the ones who want to destroy them.
Well, yeah, and it just seems to, and then Jesus is going to come, and there's going to be a war, and then he will rule over the world for 1,000 years. So it just, maybe it's just a title to me.
And then, but here's the clincher, and here's the humbling part for humankind. After 1,000 years, Satan is released, and he raises this huge army that marches to Jerusalem to try and war with God. All of those people, after 1,000 years of reign of righteousness, just like angels, when they saw the righteousness and the goodness of God ruling in the universe, and humans will have had the same intimate relationship with God and Jesus at that time. That, we don't get numbers, but it's a huge number that are going to rebel, just like the fallen angels, which is sort of the final part of the sifting, so that all the people that are moving forward into eternity after that war, after the judgment of the dead, which is the second and final resurrection, all of those that are determined, qualified to leave their name in the book of life, will have chosen God, and he will write his laws on our spirit and our hearts so that we can follow in the right ways, to sort of institute somehow, some way. It's obviously an allegory as to what gets done, but there's a change to the creation of the angelic spirit and the human spirit to permit that, so that we don't have to worry about falling to our weaknesses. And seemingly what happened with a lot of the fallen angels, it's the physical world that when they made themselves part of, which influenced their bodies, their soul and the body, which influenced their spirit. Somehow, some way. It seems to be the general connection there.
Maybe that's a time for just another model for humanity, another like day 6 and then Adam and Eve. Maybe it's another spinning of the wheel again, kind of like the Aztec calendar.
What we do know is with Jesus' resurrection is that something new is being created, because he takes that body into heaven. It becomes an interdimensional physical being, which is new. And our bodies will be just like his, meaning that it's something new that's being created, as well as a new heavens and a new earth is being created. Now, what happens after that, we don't know. One deduces we just won't be sitting around playing harps. We'll be doing something, and one would think that we would be doing something to add more life, which is what God seems to be all about, is giving the gift of life. But with that is you have to choose God.
Yeah, I think that when you look at what has been written about, where we go and how we get there, it just seems as though it's a wheel that we keep going around and around and around in circles, we don't seem to be getting any better. We're getting more destructive, but we're not getting any better as far as treating each other and humanity and compassion and love. I mean, while it's all there's such an overwhelming amount of anger, fear, and chaos that you do wonder, how do you go forward from here? I mean, just in the simple, I mean, the fact that there's war in the world today. I mean, they talked about, have talked about World War III, and it does appear it's already there. So, we aren't quite involved in it yet, but, it's only a matter of time. So it's sort of like we're on a slippery slope, and is there no way to slow it down?
And that's the point. As it plays out, the only way it stops is the last sort of intercession of this age before the millennium, where Jesus steps in, lest all flesh would be destroyed. Like the goal of the bloodlines, of the perpetual war people, will have come about. And if God hadn't have stepped in before the flood and permitted the flood to come, or had the fallen angels bring the flood, as it's accounted for in the polytheist versions, so that the world wouldn't be destroyed by fire and a second chance. And similarly at Babel, where you have an Antichrist figure who is a great warrior, who is a tyrant over control with the Enochian mysticism at Babel, the Babylon religion, over all of the Noahites, which are the direct descendants and survivors from the Adamites. You have that happening at that point in time, and God intercedes again. Otherwise, obviously, by the looks of it, it's going to be that humankind is going to be wiped from the face of the earth. And so we are, as bringing back into Ecclesiastes 1, what we are seeing today would be very, very similar to a period just before the flood came. And, of course, God promised never to bring the flood again, but he didn't promise not to permit the fire, just like fire was used to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, because all the crimes, as 2 Peter 2 and Jude 1:6 to about 15 talks about the crimes at Sodom were the same crimes that were destroyed, that were done by the fallen angels and the giants before the flood. And that when Jesus provided his chronology of the end time fig tree generation, right after the fig tree generation as an overarching sign, you have the days of Noah sign, that it's going to be like the days of Noah. And that days of Noah can be understood as a generation. That we're told to learn about what happened just before the flood that would have been, by inference, likely destroyed by fire, except for the intercession of God and the flood. So this would be very identical, that nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. And the understanding of that only brings grief and sorrow. Ecclesiastes 1.
Well, understanding that the earth is millions of years old, and according to science, there have been at least 5 mass extinctions, and in which life began again and evolved and was destroyed and began again. And I'm wondering if that can go along with the biblical stuff, because it's the same thing. I mean, it's been destroyed by fire with asteroids at one time, and floods, again, asteroids or comets or whatever. So, I mean, can you combine the two to say the planet, whether it's of our own accord or if, God just sends a comet and hits the planet?
I think you can. And in Section 8, and we'll talk in detail probably more about it next week, I make mention of how that comes into play. And I've kind of touched on it a little bit. So knowing I can't make the whole case right now, I'll just sort of talk about it's why we need to understand 2 Peter 3, where that talks about a day is 1,000 years, but it also talks about the world that was in the beginning, that was in the water and out of the water, that was destroyed by fire and perished, and that this is the same destruction that's reserved for the end time. So when in the beginning, that's Genesis 1:1-2, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. In verse 2 is where you have the Holy Spirit, Ruach of the Elohim, Spirit of God, hovering over the chaos, because this world has been destroyed. And so when you look at what it says in Genesis 1:2, it says the world was, paraphrasing it probably says the earth, but it was void and formless. Well, that word was is the Hebrew word haya. And you can translate that as became or was. And Psalms 104 says when God renews the earth, and this is a parallel passage to Genesis 1 that includes angelic creation, when God sends his spirit, the earth is renewed. And so I think you have more of a renewal of the earth going on in days 1-6. And I'll get in deeper into, if we cover this off next week, on the Hebrew words that are void and formless and other passages that support that. Sometime between Genesis 1:1 and 2, there was the angelic war, which is a better fit. It was that angelic technology that destroyed the earth down to the foundations. And when that happened, the firmament, the waters above, collapsed and the earth perished. Sometime later, we have no idea how long later, the earth is renewed when God sends his Holy Spirit, as the Spirit is seen hovering over the chaos. And so if you're going to recreate the earth, you're going to have to, and create life on the earth, you're going to have to separate the waters below to the water and make the waters of the above to separate the two so that life can form on the earth. And God called that heaven in Genesis 1. So even in Exodus 20:18, where it says God created the earth, heaven and earth in 6 days, heaven can mean the firmament, the sun in can mean what's outside the firmament, or it can mean the place where God and the angels dwell in the spirit dimension. So you can match Exodus 20:18 with the firmament being heaven, as it's called heaven once he creates the firmament. And it just makes more sense that if you're going to interpret in the beginning in 2 Peter 3, that all starts to make perfect sense. And that when you have the renewal of the earth, then you have the pantheon of the gods, of the angels who have already rebelled at some unknown time before, and they're going to lead the Nahash species into polytheism. That's going to lead the people of day 6 into polytheism. There's some sort of flood or destruction, probably a flood, because the fire is only reserved to the end time. And we could have had a flood at 10,000 BC. You can pick any time where you want to put that, or before that. And at some point later, Adam is created with a different sort of creation process and renames all of the animals. And he's there for a specific reason, to end the angelic rebellion.
Yeah, I think so many people get confused with the days and don't realize that, I mean, the earth was at some point the domain of the angels. And then God put humans in here and we screwed everything up. We didn't screw it all. Well, yeah, we did, actually. So that something that seemed perfect and an angelic domain, once you put humans into it, the angels got angry and wanted their domain back, and ergo thousands of years of conflict, which is, horrifying. But hopefully we can step back from the edge a little bit now and then, and because an age can be thousands of years, we don't have to worry about getting insurance against Armageddon quite yet. Not quite yet, but, the day will come.
I think if the world collectively got its act together, you could push things off. I mean, that's been sort of the lesson all the way through. But there is an ordained time. There's a point when you can't push it back, and the fear is that the way things are in the world today so fits the end time scenario that we may be in that fig tree generation, and that may have kicked off in 1967 when Judea, the fig tree in prophetic allegory, took Jerusalem, which is the epicenter of end time prophecy. So if we are in the fig tree generation, it's just how many years can we push it back? But whether it's 40 years, 70 years, 120 years, there's a specific generation that we can rely on from Scripture, one of those three numbers after 1967, when we are going to enter into the last 7 years that Daniel 9:27 talks about.
Wow. I just saw the time. Can you let people know where they can get you and find your material before Blog Talk shuts us up?
Yes. So the best place to get a hold of me or to order my books or to get information on my books is on my website at the Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6, the number 6conspiracy.com. And one announcement is I'm going through the approval process right now for the Audible version of Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2. And that should be hopefully done and published in the next couple of weeks. And that will be distributed through Amazon Audible and iTunes, just as Book 1 is already up and is doing quite well for Audible. I have a buy now page on that website, and if you wanted to get a signed copy, I have 3 pages. I ship out of Canada. I'm Canadian. And so I have a Canadian page, I have a U.S. page, and if you live anywhere else in the world, there's an international page. And you can also link over to barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, and amazon.ca to purchase the book there for a print copy, and over to Amazon for the Kindle version that's available too as a link on the Buy Now page. And once the Book 2 Audible is up there, I will get the website redone, and I will put a link up for the Audible versions of Book 1 and Book 2 as well. And there's a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters of Book 1 that we've been covering and all 84 chapters of Book 2. And if you wanted to get a hold of me to ask me a question, to get a little bit more information on something that I might have talked about, just hit contact the author and shoot the email to me. It'll take me a couple of 3 months to probably get back to you on it, but I will get back to you.
Absolutely. And the books are well worth having and reading through. Speaking of one who has read this book at least 3, maybe 4 or 5 times. So thank you so much, Gary, and thank you so much, everybody, for being with us tonight. I'll be back on Thursday with a reading show, so please join me there then. Look forward to next Monday when we try to tie all this up in a great ribbon. Good night, everybody.